Hey guys, this is Jonathan Lampel here from Blender HD, and in this tutorial I'm going to go over how to shatter glass. So this will work with any sort of glass-like material, say like ceramics or something of that sort. And so let's just get right into it. You could use this for say like a kitchen glass or a wine glass or something, but I'm just going to make a window just to be simple. Okay, so to do that I'm going to delete the default cube, add a plane, go into edit mode, scale it about 3 times, so S and 3, and then I'm just going to extrude it just a little bit. Not a whole lot, but enough to give it a little bit of thickness. Alright, then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees along the x-axis, and finally bring it up just so it sits on the ground. So that's pretty simple, but this is going to be our window. If you wanted to, you could model the entire, plane and have a ground and all of that, but for now, I'm just going to stick with this. Alright, so next, I'm going to add an object to hit the window. So, I think I want a baseball going through the window. So to do that, I'm just going to add a sphere and scale it down and press Ctrl A and apply the scale. You need to be sure that you apply the scale if you're doing any, transformations in object mode, because if you don't, it might mess up with the bullet simulation that we're doing later. Alright, so how to do this is first we need to position the baseball where we want it to hit the window. So you might want yours, going straight through the window, but I kind of want mine in the corner. So I'm going to place it right there, and you have to be sure that it's going through the window mesh. So just be sure that it's directly in the center there, and place it anywhere around here that you'd like. Okay, so now to actually shatter it, we're going to, with the sphere selected, shift select the window and press Ctrl P, parent to object. So you can see what this has done. If I move this around, it has parented the sphere to the plane. Alright, so now for the shattering part, we're going to use the cell fracture. And now, if you're using an older version of Blender, you won't be able to use this feature. So just go to blender.org and download either the test build or 2.66 if that's out by the time you're watching. And that should be there, as well as the bullet physics that we're going to be using later. Okay, so now to actually fracture it, we're just going to, with that selected, hit cell fracture, and you get a whole bunch of options. Now, thinking about this, the way we want a window to shatter is it kind of shatters around a point, the point of impact of the object that's hitting it. So the closer to that object, the smaller the shards are going to be, and the farther away, the bigger the shards. So that's really easy to do because we can enable child vertices and deselect own particles, because we don't want to use any of these. We want to use the vertices of the child. So that's going to mean the shards are coming directly out of that same spot. I'm going to leave the source limit at 100. What this does is it sets the maximum number of shards. So say if I have 1,000 vertices in this sphere for some reason, and I set this to 100, it's only going to make 100 shards. Keep in mind that if I only have 10 vertices and I set this as high as possible, it doesn't matter what I do because it's only going to have 10. Alright, so moving on, the noise value here applies kind of a Voronoi pattern. It doesn't necessarily make things more jagged, but it applies noise. And the higher you set this, the more Voronoi pattern-like it's going to look. And we don't really want that, so I'm going to set this to a really low value, say 0.05. So it's giving us just a little bit of noise. Lastly, I'm going to set the recursion to 2. What this does is it takes the initial shards and shatters them again, and then setting it to 2 shatters the already shattered shards. So basically you're increasing it exponentially, increasing the amount of shards exponentially. Alright, so I'm going to set I'm going to keep the random at 0.25, and this is more like a percentage. So say I want 25% of the big shards to be shattered again. This will leave the small shards, they don't need to be, shattered more than once, but all of the big ones do. Then I'm going to set this to 0, which means that every single shard, as long as it's within these parameters, is going to be shattered. So say if you need to set this really high for some reason, you can set the limits to say, something like 500 or 1,000, and it'll completely stop once it reaches that number. But the reason we don't want it here is because you'll get these large chunks with no shattering if for some reason I don't set it high enough. So I'm just going to disable it by setting it to 0. Lastly, I'm just going to remove that so we don't have any doubles, and hit OK. This does take a couple minutes, but you can see it's at least somewhat interesting to watch in real time. What it's doing is it's breaking each of the pieces up and then breaking them again with the recursion. And it does take a couple minutes since I set the recursion to 2, but it will give us a much better result. While we're waiting, I can go over a few more of these options here. Just things to keep in mind. Oh, never mind. Guess we'll save that for another day. Alright, so if we go into wireframe mode by pressing Z, you can see the shatters that we have. And it looks pretty good. It's kind of like a spider web. And you can see that if we select, some in here, there aren't any big pieces that stretch all the way to the edge. And that's the important part. So we don't want any pieces that, cover one entire face. So that's good. This is definitely what we want. So just to make sure there aren't any duplicate objects, just select one of the edges, and sometimes the self-fracture makes a duplicate of the original, so just be aware of that. Alright, so now you know how to shatter glass effectively, but now we're going to actually break it using the bullet physics. So the way to do this is just select everything, make one of them the active object, go down here under the rigid body tools and hit add active. Now you'll get this message, but it doesn't really mean anything at the moment because I don't know, self-fracture does that sometimes. It creates sort of empty objects, but you don't really need to worry about it because it won't affect the simulation at all. So right before I run this, I'm going to save. It's always a good idea to save before you run physics and such. Window shatter. Okay, good enough. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this sphere and I'm actually going to move it to this layer down here. So you can see on this layer we have the sphere that's going to be going through the window. On this layer we have the completely clean window, and in this layer we have the window that's all fractured. So if I shift select this layer, you can see that we are viewing both of them at the same time. Now if I play this back, you can remember that we already added bullet physics, so this is just kind of falling down. And what we can do now is get this ball to go straight through the window. But we don't really want the window to be falling right away because that's kind of silly. So what we need to do is hit A to deselect everything, select all of these, make sure one of them is the active object, and then here under the rigid body tools we can enable deactivation and start deactivated. Then once we press copy from active, it's going to copy these settings throughout all of our selection. So if we play this, nothing's going to happen because it's deactivated at the beginning and won't be activated until another rigid body hits it. Alright, so now we can animate the ball. What we want to do is at frame 1, just kind of move it back along the y-axis to about there, and hit I and location to insert a location keyframe. Then at about frame 15, I'm going to move up really close to about there, and also hit I and location. So you can see that if we play this back, it kind of goes really fast and then stops. And the reason I'm only going to here is because at about this distance, I'm sorry. Okay. At about this distance, I'm going to transform this into a rigid body. So if I enable the rigid body settings and play this back, you can see that it pretty much ignores all of the animation that we've already set up. But if you check this, it's going to incorporate the animation, but it's not going to have any of the rigid body characteristics. So this might seem like it's not useful at all, but it actually is, because this little checkbox right here can be animated, as with almost anything in Blender. So on frame 15, actually I'll go frame 14, just to be safe. I'm going to press I while hovering over this checkbox here to keyframe the fact that right now it's animated. Then on frame 15, I'm going to uncheck it and press I, so right now it's not animated. So I'm just going to save this, and if you play it back, you can see it becomes a rigid body and hits the window. But it just kind of bounces off at the moment, and it's, you know, it doesn't really look like a window shattering. So what you got to make sure you do is make sure you have apply scale by pressing Control A. Just do that periodically to make sure you don't have any problems. And then here I'm going to change the mass from 1 all the way to 50. And let's see what that does. Great. So now it's actually breaking straight through the window, and it looks pretty good. Maybe I want it to break through a little bit more. I want more of an explosive kind of break. So I'm going to add or change this all the way to 200. If I play through, you see it breaks a little bit more, and that's pretty good. So that's the basics of how to break it. One last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a ground plane for these, shards to fall on. So to do that, I'm just going to hit Shift S and cursor to center, then Shift A, add a plane, then in edit mode, scale it up a bunch, and make sure that it's not intersecting this here, so move it down about there, E to extrude to give it a little depth, go back into object mode, and make it a passive rigid body. So make things active when they need to move, and make things passive when they don't need to move. And since this is just staying still, it can be passive. So then when I play this back, it looks great. A couple things that I want to do to this, just before I end here, is, a lot of windows don't shatter all around. If you have a window in a pane, it doesn't, like the edges and stuff, there's sometimes pieces of glass left over. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my box select by pressing B and drag across these edges here, getting as close to the edge as possible, and then deselect that. Then if I make one of these by the active object by selecting it, I can change this to a passive rigid body. Or actually no, I'll keep it on active, but I'm going to move up the translation and rotation dampening, and then over here copy from active. So they will move, but not a whole lot. Actually, I don't, yeah, I need to set this up a little bit higher, so maybe about there. There we go. Keeping it at 1 works well. So they kind of get shoved out of the way. Alright, so there we go. Since we set the dampening all the way up to 1, if you have a frame around here, it'll kind of keep these in check without, pushing them out. But they will move a little bit, so you'll get the nice sort of light reflections, and it won't be completely flat, but they won't really move around a whole bunch, which is good. One last thing, something that's really common in glass breaking is to have a slow motion effect, and this is super easy to do, and yeah, it doesn't take very much time at all. So over here under the scene settings, we have a rigid body world, and it's just basically a checkbox. If you uncheck it, then there are no rigid body dynamics going on, but obviously we want that checked. And what we can do is change the speed from 1 to 0.25. That way when we play this back, it does everything in slow motion, which is pretty cool. And you can set this to be as slow as you want. Another thing to note in the rigid body world settings here is the steps per second and solver iteration. If you find that your simulation isn't very accurate, if it's not accurate enough, you can change this here. I'll change this to 120 and this one to 50, and what it does is it just increases the quality of the overall simulation. So there we go. And I know I said we're almost done, but one very last thing, which is really important. If you try and render this, it's going to look really bad, because at the beginning, if I go into cycles here and make this a glass, oh, I guess I have to copy all of them. Okay, 1 second here. Just select all of these, select that one, and copy material to others. Okay, there we go. So you can see here this is glass, but all the cracks are already there, which, if it hasn't been shattered yet, really looks awful. So this is why I used separate layers. And if I go back to this one, I'm actually going to move the lamp in the camera to this layer as well. So we have kind of our scene objects on this layer, our unfractured glass, and our fractured glass. And the way to combine these is by basically selecting all of them, and before you render, go into the layers. And you got to make sure that your simulation is cached, which should be. Yeah, so just make sure you can scrub through the timeline here. And you can see that the point of impact is right at basically frame 15. So on frame 14 we don't want it shattered, but on frame 15 we do. Now it's not completely accurate, but if I put it here, then it would kind of jump, and we don't really want that. So here we don't want it shattered. So down here I'm going to exclude the shattered layer and hit I. Then on frame 14 I'm going to switch the two and hit I again. Oh, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Exclude the shattered layer there, and then on frame 15 exclude the unshattered layer. So that way when you're rendering at exactly the right point, it'll switch layers to where it won't be shattered beforehand. So if you see here, if I render this real quick, you can see the glass that's being rendered is completely clean. I don't need that many samples, I just need 10 for now. Okay, so you can see the glass here is completely clean, and that's not even glass. Okay, there we go. Seriously? Okay. I just one more time. Okay. There we go. So glass here is completely unshattered and clean. However, if we move past that threshold where it breaks, right about there, render this, you can see that it's now broken. So, this is really important, and if you're trying to render glass, this is kind of practical, but now you know how to fix it. Alright, so thank you for watching, and if you like this video, if you learned something new, then don't be afraid to like it, and for more tutorials, definitely subscribe.